At this time in the world's history, there are more people living in cities than at any other period of mankind's newly spawned residency. And indeed, the number of city dwellers worldwide is increasing by more than 1 million every week. As the cities grow larger, mostly due to expanding suburban housing requirements and an urge, particularly in eastern countries, to build yet more houses and apartments on top of houses and apartments, the historical, architectural, cultural and primarily original locations established and built by founding settlers become more important and worthwhile visiting. Prague is no exception. In fact, this capital city of the recently democratized Czech Republic is a really good option to visit if you are keen to walk, tram and taxi less, and actually spend time seeing and enjoying its superb legacy and offerings. The key locations are all easily accessed on foot, assuming you are based somewhere close to the centre initially. Even the castle over the other side of the river Vltava, and unsurprisingly on the highest local hill, can be walked to with ease by crossing the famous Charles Bridge. So having established that exploring this city can be easy-going on not only the budget and the footwear, but with its relatively small population of around 2 million people, you can see all the city has to offer without constantly bumping into the residents and trying to say sorry in the Czech language. Welcome to the 14th largest city in the European Union, the 6th most popular European capital for visitor numbers, a political, cultural and economic centre of Europe for over 1100 years, a city where many historical buildings miraculously survived the violence and destruction of 20th century aggressions, home of the tasty basted boar, the defiant Lenin Wall, and of course, the true historical capital of Bohemia proper. This is Prague. The first settlers to gather wood, spark up a fire and cogitate on the local amenities and vantage points probably arrived in this area of the river during the Paleolithic period. A couple of hundred years before Christ strolled out of a carpenter's shop much further to the east, Celts arrived and struck up a settlement a little further to the south and pondered the value and effort required to make some form of viewpoint on the distant hill overlooking the Vltava. Fast forward time, and after Marcomannis from the east and possibly Suebi tribes from the west took up residence, we arrive in a period when massive migration was taking place after the collapse of the Roman Empire, which affected Prague greatly, as it was in fact the homestead of 2 Roman emperors and had therefore then also been a capital of the Holy Roman Empire. As the Romans ignominiously scuttled back towards their own country, yet more Marcomanni arrived, and the foundations of what we would call Prague began to be laid. Legend tells us that a Czech duchess and her husband started the timbers rolling up the hill to make a wooden fort and defences around 800 AD, surprisingly large, as it occupied about 2/3 of the area now covered by Prague Castle. Indeed, the earliest masonry tested at the castle dates from the year 885. With another fort founded about 200 years later, the region actually became very popular as a trading centre, and merchants, including a large Jewish population, began to gather and settle here. It became the residence and seat of power for many dukes, and later the kings of Bohemia ruled from this fine small city. The name Prague derives from an old Slavic word, Praga, meaning ford. The first bridge was constructed around 1170, and bridges have a lot of impact on newly founding riverside habitats. The new city even had its own slave market. Then, in 1257, King Ottokar II developed the Lesser Quarter, or Prague Castle area, as we would know it now. This was the resident and trading district of the German people, who had the right to administer the area. But it was under the reign of Charles IV, a Roman emperor and the King of Bohemia during the mid-14th century, that this advantageous city began to really lay down some stonework. He literally transformed Prague into the third largest city in Europe of its time, beaten only to the touchline by Rome itself and Constantinople. On the 9th of July, 1357, Charles personally laid the first foundation stone of Charles Bridge. And standing here today, it's very easy to feel that you see exactly the same images as he'd imagined over 700 years ago, as he surveyed the work on the bridge, and perhaps the first sight of the growing cathedral as it clambered higher than the walls of the surrounding defensive fort just a little way away. All went well for many years of Charles's reign. They even founded a mint here, where German and Italian bankers and merchants did their thing. But, as is often the case historically, underneath such gatherings of affluence and the affluent, social disorder began to rise, alongside the increasingly turbulent power of the craftsmen and a greater number of poor families. Charles had a good go at trying to settle the unrest by commissioning the Hunger Wall, its twofold purpose being not only to substantiate the defences of this growing city, but to provide employment, wages, and therefore food to those whose families worked on the new construction. When the monarch died in 1378, his son Wenceslas took over the reins and reigned over a period of increased tumult. During the Easter celebrations of 1389, outraged Prague clergy declared the Jews had performed an act of desecration. Word spread rapidly, and mobs were encouraged to pillage and ransack the Jewish quarter. Sadly, the poorly advised and poorly fed were enthusiastic for the task, and nearly all of Prague's 3,000-strong Jewish population perished. Attacked by so-called crusaders and mercenaries during the Hussite Wars, the city did its best with a limited militia, lost their flag to some invading Swedish troops, licked its wounds, and focused on becoming a reputed city of trade and into the Habsburg era. In 1526, when the House of Habsburg elected Ferdinand I, it was all very Catholic and somewhat fervent. But Protestant ideas were truly becoming popular, and these two primary aspects of Christian faith would occasionally contest each other. When Rudolf II was elected King of Bohemia in 1576, he decided Prague Castle would be a home and centre of administration, and in fairness to this open-minded royal, all scientists, alchemists, religions, artists, philosophers, musicians, and even fortune-tellers and astrologers were welcome. Prague was now the capital city of European culture and ultimately prospered. But 50 years later, all was not so good. Kings had come and gone, Czech leaders overthrown, battles lost, and the population dropped to about 20,000 people. Surprisingly, about 25% of the residents were newly born and immigrant Jews. And then a massive fire devastated the city in 1689, spurring the populace to rebuild and renovate. So Prague's population and wealth began to grow again. The balance of power locally fell away from German hands. They were shaken but only mildly stirred by the late 19th century revolutions around Europe, as suppression took hold of their vulnerable country until the defeat of the Austro-Hungarian Empire during World War I, when Czechoslovakia was created and Prague chosen to be its capital city, with President Thomas Masaryk planting his chair in Prague Castle. By 1930, the population stood and sat at around 850,000. The Second World War had its historically recognised effect on the Jewish population yet again, with most being deported. In 1942, the city incurred Hitler's wrath by being the site of a significant Nazi assassination, and Prague citizens paid the toll for the bravery of two of its national heroes. After being bombed by American forces, liberty followed in 1945. But it would be another 40 years of Cold War before Prague and the newly created Czech Republic could fly its flags and ring its bells as the people finally managed to create their independence and welcome travellers and visitors from all over the world to the Czech people's favourite capital city. Earlier, I made the bold claim that one climb up the hill to the castle would be the hardest part of any footwork around Prague. And so, let us start our tour at this panoramic spot where all of Prague can be seen. Once inside the castle wall's historical defence, our view is blocked. So we best get our bearings and enjoy the city laid out before us. It would be fair to say that Prague doesn't really have a castle as such, more a congregation of buildings with a big wall around them. This would probably reflect on the historic nature of this city and its overall development of trade, art and freedom of expression and tolerance. Remember, we're talking 1,000 years of history here, not a singular precedent for defence and domination as in classic castle settings. With quality music from almost film set dressed traditional musicians busking outside the gate, past the mandatory guards who are more photographed than a reality TV celebrity, we enter a courtyard and can begin to take in the details of this somewhat glorious Renaissance structure that was primarily built in the 16th century. It is in fact considered to be the largest castle in the world, being about 570 metres long and 130 metres wide. Most of which you can wander free of charge. It only requires small coin of the realm to enter some of the more specific locations, but those locations are well worth the coin, and we'll look at them shortly. Every city has a cathedral, of course, and they regularly feature in this series. But this one is a bit special. It's impressive, popular, a justifiable location on our city break map. St. Vitus Cathedral, or to use its full name just the once, St. Vitus, St. Wenceslas and St. Adalbert Cathedral, is the biggest and most important church in the country. Roman Catholic in denomination, it is the home church of the Archbishop of Prague and contains the tombs of many Bohemian kings and Holy Roman Emperors. It is the third building at this site dedicated to St. Vitus, and this homage was first paid in around 925 AD by Wenceslas, the former Duke of Bohemia, when he laid his hands on an arm of St. Vitus, receiving this holy relic from Emperor Henry I. He built a Roman-style rotunda and was keen to convert the decreasing pagan faction to Christianity. Historically, there has been no more an incentive for conversion and influence than to take a relic or anatomical piece of a dead saint, house it in a bespoke building, and encourage mere mortals to view, worship, and indeed pay tribute. Sometimes through dedication and devotion, at other times through fear. Years passed, and as the congregation overflowed from the iconic site, so another larger church was built on the same spot around 1060 AD, long after Wenceslas' death, but during a time when he too became a patron saint. This third incarnation of this building was founded in 1344, as previously mentioned, during the reign of Charles IV, who took the construction very seriously and ultimately wanted it to be the coronation church, family crypt of kings, housing for the precious relics of the kingdom, and of course the honour of accommodating Wenceslas for all time. It is important to appreciate that sites such as these were the focus of attention for worshippers, and indeed utilised by the church and the crown in any country to receive income, donation, and perhaps subservience from the faithful, enriching the relevant church body and the monarchy at the same time. Sometimes such locations were possibly fictional, but created when the church was under severe financial pressures, as could well be the case with Glastonbury Cathedral in England regarding the tomb of King Arthur, but such is not the same of St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague. Concrete is a very important aspect of modern construction, but it is sad to see the effects that weather, climate and man-made pollution has on these recent buildings. It is only by seeing such buildings as this with the naked eye that you can really appreciate the maturity and seasoning of the work of the masons at the time. And we have Matthias of Arras to thank for importing his Arras experience and French Gothic traditions with the early parts of this architecture. He died relatively early in the process, however, and it is the blending of his work and plans, as well as those of his successor, Peter Parler, who was only 23 years old, that create this unique structure, as sculptor and woodcarver took over the design from geometrist and mathematician. To add to his workload, Charles commissioned Parler to work on the Charles Bridge and other projects which inevitably slowed down the steady growth of the new cathedral. It still wasn't completed on his death, and his sons inevitably took over. But the Hussite War stopped the process after the best part of 100 years, and indeed the fire of 1541 added to the iconoclasm. This impressive building lay half-finished for several centuries. That's a long time, and inevitably Baroque and Gothic revival influences came to bear, with subsequent commissions, which is why this is such a good cathedral to understand the effects of change over the years. It seems to have taken over 600 years to finish. Surrounded by the crush of many visitors from literally all over the world, and a storm of flashing cameras making for a stroboscopic view on occasion, we'll get up close and personal with the holiest of grails here, Wenceslas's chapel and tomb. 20 years in the making, initially completed in 1364, there are over 1,300 precious stones and paintings here depicting the Passion of Christ, and they are all original works, which accounts for why the general public cannot come into this chapel. Centre wall, there's a wonderful statue of Wenceslas, created by Parler's nephew in 1373, and the upper walls are covered with biographical paintings that date from the early 1600s. It is darker in here, as befits the chapel of the revered saint and warrior. He really is an early example of celebrity, murdered on his way to church at the age of 28 by friends of his younger brother. No less than 4 biographies of his life were in print within decades, resulting in his posthumous martyrdom and sainthood, as the hagiographies played their part in creating the legend that became immortalised as a Christmas song during the mid-1800s. An even darker place to visit is the crypt and royal tomb of this cathedral. Interred here are many kings, including Charles IV, archbishops, provincial patron saints, and of course Wenceslas himself. The crypt is simple enough, no fancy decor, perhaps more of a resting place than a viewing area. Back up the stairs to the well-lit cathedral, and we cannot miss St. John of Nepomuc's tomb. The national saint of the Czech Republic, variations in the reports of history suggest he may have died as a result of a not-so-saintly act by Wenceslas, after John refused to pass on information from the Queen received during confession. He subsequently took an enforced tumble into the nearby Vltava River, and as a consequence is deemed to be not only a martyr, but also a protector from floods. The silver for this coffin weighed a massive 1,680 kilos, and I have no idea who paid for it. It's an impressive tomb, albeit a little confusing for many tourists who stop and touch the reflective artwork. Wandering on through the cathedral, it is interesting to see the range of architecture as the years rumbled by. There are few buildings you can visit that feature Gothic and Neo-Gothic architecture where such effort has been made to blend the two ages of design. Indeed, it is outside that you can understand exactly when and for how long construction was halted initially by the Hussite Wars, with the South Tower having a rounded cap on a primarily Gothic base. Such were the gentler curves of the style known as Renaissance. From here, it is but a short walk and we can make a visit to the Treasury, wherein now is displayed, alongside many other precious artefacts, the previously referenced arm of St. Vitus, albeit an old relic. The gold, silver and stonework on show demonstrates well the craftwork of old-time Bohemian artisans. Still remaining inside the castle grounds, we come now to somewhere a little different and rather unique. This is Golden Lane, and dates from the 15th century. Here are 11 historic houses, reputedly the home of alchemists and goldsmiths, although it would be reasonably fair to consider them mostly one and the same during those more secretive years of special metalwork. sensitively restored and presented, the houses are in periodic dressage to show the lifestyle of their one-time real-life occupants. Initially constructed when the new outer wall was added to the complex, the original houses were probably much smaller and were replaced over time by the more luxurious accommodation laid out over 500 years ago. Nevertheless, they still do not show as properties of significance, and over the years have been the accommodations of both poor, artistic and creative alike, sometimes voluntarily by more modern playwrights and bohemians. The upper floors have been renovated to form one long gallery, and it now houses a superb collection of medieval armoury and textile work. There are items here that make you squirm as you consider the implications and effects of such equipment from so long ago. And indeed, it is quite amazing to see the quality of the items and how well preserved they actually are. There are, of course, many other features to explore here at Prague Castle, but our time is limited. Before we take the easy steps down to the river and into the main city of Prague, there is one more call to make, and that is outside the castle grounds to the northwest, the Loreta. This is a true 350-year-old pilgrimage destination. A little off the main beat, but worthwhile the wander. It is quiet and rather subdued after the hubbub of chattering tourists in the cathedral and castle grounds. Here, many items of iconic and religious nature have been preserved and are reverently attended to and closely guarded by a small group of apparently ancient women. Paintings, mosaics, a large collection of confessionals that could reveal many a delicious story if the timbers could but talk. When you've finished wandering past the serious and sometimes morbid displays, a lighter air can be detected when we discover the most colourful of displays available in all its modernistic glory, the bling. Centre stage is the crowning piece by Johann Bernhard Fischer. This extraordinary work is covered with 6,222 diamonds. Looking at it closely, I couldn't help wondering how many diamonds Johann would have dropped while making it, and the subsequent floor scrabbling that would have taken place. On that lighter note, time to leave this sombre site, pausing only to refresh the view from the castle heights, down the steps, past the Wenceslas vineyard, which dates to a time earlier than the castle, and ground-level Prague opens up before us. Before we cross the river, though, we are going to the Lenin Wall. Well be asking why we're featuring what appears to be no more than an irresponsible teenage graphic outlet in a tour of one of the world's more interesting capital cities. As far as I can tell, no one ever died here in protest. It is not a centralised location. It is but an ordinary wall in a well-populated residential area. But on this wall are painted the one-time grievances of unhappy Czech youths who found a way to express their discontent with ink and paint. Ironically called the Leninism movement, sadly the original portraits and comments have long gone, with subsequent generations applying their own brand of magic marker. It is surprisingly hard to overcome the urge to add a small comment or doodle by way of nostalgia for our own bohemian teenage years and past. There are no specific heroes credited with contributions here. After dark, it would be possible to add a few clandestine words or provocative images indeed, but you have to consider the implications of such actions and the risks being taken by young protesters in a time of authoritarian rule not so many years ago. Sometimes the authorities would completely repaint the wall, describing the offenders as alcoholics, mentally unstable, and even agents of Western capitalism. Now tourists make their own marks daily and are regularly photographed here without any thought or threat of arrest or censorship. A little further down the road there's another interesting example of solidarity and right to freedom of expression. This little bridge bears the burden of hundreds of padlocks attached, and the keys presumed to be thrown into the babbling brook below. As we filmed, a news crew arrived and told us that due to damage to the bars, plans were now underway to remove all the locks. It'll be interesting to see if they all mysteriously reappear when such a cleanup has been completed. Away now from the centres of administration, law, the church, and even the points of protest. Time now to cross the Vltava, and as the sun is shining, we'll do so from the north, in order to see Prague's most beautiful river crossing in all her medieval glory, Charles Bridge. 600 years of daily toing and froing. Processions, battles, ceremonies, and even executions. This bridge has seen and supported all of them for a very long time. Man's obsession with keeping his feet dry when crossing water has meant that such sturdy models are in existence worldwide. But this one is particularly important to movie makers. The least crowded time to put a foot on Charles Bridge is early morning, so I shall follow my own advice. Time for a beer and a good view of Prague's nighttime before stepping forth tomorrow onto King Charles IV's greatest legacy. Pre-visualised from the movies Amadeus and indeed Mission Impossible, today we're lucky to have a low-capacity crowd. It has in fact only been called Charles Bridge since 1870, previously being known as Stone Bridge or Prague Bridge. 621 metres long, it took around 200 years to fully complete, and greatly helped Prague become an epicentre of trade between Western and Eastern Europe. Today, all is at peace on Charles Bridge, but it has of course survived a turbulent history, both natural and man-made. Impede water at your own peril, but Charles Bridge and centuries of maintenance has helped it survive some enormous floods. The towers are truly picturesque, and thankfully the practice of hanging the heads of the executed by way of greeting or warning has long ago ceased. In fairness, most statues are replications of the originals, but you can easily see history here, and indeed stand on the spot marked with a cross where Nepomuk took his reluctant dive. But then other historic documents reveal that he was already dead before immersion. I spy another place where padlocks are left. Perhaps this will become the new symbol spot for this expression of freedom. The view of the castle and cathedral is good from here and belies the gentle inclination we walked down. There are now many bridges across the Vltava river, but Charles will always be the best of the bunch, and traditionally will continue to be the best dry foot passage must-do for all tourists for centuries to come. We're going to visit 3 squares of open space in Prague. 2 are busy with lots of activity and people, the third isn't. 20 minutes level walking is going to find us at less populated stop number 1, Charles Square. This quiet open space looks good in autumn. There's a chill to the air and the leaves are falling crisply and cleanly. It is in fact one of the largest city squares in the world, and possibly the largest medieval example in Europe. This is the centre of Newtown. It was founded in 1348, again by the busy King Charles. No medley of people here or vendors to encourage your coins. It is a place of rest and respite from the busier parts of Prague. On one side is the seemingly innocuous St. Ignatius Church. And even though we dedicated a fair amount of time to Prague Cathedral, it is worthwhile making a brief visit to this church as one of the earliest Baroque buildings here. Notable for the affluence of its buildings and contents, it is a colourful, dignified and quiet respite from the nearby hub of tram and railway centre. Began in 1665 and originally planned as a basilica, the church was designed to show worshippers the power and wealth of the Jesuit faith. There are many statues of Jesuit and Czech saints here. Back outside to the former cattle market, now known as Charles Square, again we can choose not to catch the readily available tram and take Shanks Pony onwards for 15 minutes to a busier open spot, moving in the process from Newtown to Old Town and into the very heart of Prague, Old Town Square. People have been eating spit roasted boar here for nearly 1,000 years. Combine that with a glass of hot mead and you are well set up for the day. Vegetarian pick-me-ups are also readily available. There are a number of churches here, but with one important theological location still to visit, we will have a break from buildings of worship in Old Town Square. Of surprising interest, and a gathering place on the hour every hour, is the astronomical clock. This is an old timepiece, and it takes a while to fully understand all the information being displayed. The tourists may cluster for some important action that doesn't really take place. It is in the minutiae that this feature can be truly appreciated. First installed in 1410, it is the oldest working clock in the world, and I think the third oldest surviving timepiece. The mechanics and the astronomical dial are the earliest aspects, the calendar dial added around 1490. Needless to say, it's been stopped many times in history, including being set on fire by the retreating German army in 1945. But in 2010, it celebrated its 600th birthday, and with all parts functioning, it's a pleasure to see. Dates move, planets orbit, and much clunking and clanking takes place. Chronology, astrology, astronomy are all in action here. In ways, the clock acts as a simple planetarium, advising us of the current state of the universe. Around the outside, easier seen through a telescope, are the names or name days in the calendar. Old Czech time or Italian hours are also displayed, with the number 24 indicating sunset. This changes all year round. All in all, it's an impressive timepiece, albeit not quite as legendary a spectacle as is anticipated. The square gives us some respite from narrow Prague streets, but can become a hotspot of population in the summer season. Now here in autumn, it is a blessing, and we get a chance to see the expanse. The main memorial is to Jan Hus, who failed to impress the Vatican in Rome with his forward-thinking and open attitude to language in the Catholic faith. And as a consequence, he was burned at the stake in 1415. His name has become a symbol of strength against oppressive regimes over the centuries, and this monument was unveiled in 1915 to commemorate the man 500 years after his death. The inscription reads, "Truth will prevail." A church dedicated to St. Nicholas. Seemingly vast areas to wander, before heading back into the small streets and the House at the Minute, or Domu Minuti, a Renaissance building covered in ornate decorations of alchemical and Greek significance. Just off this square, my eye was caught by one of Prague's more unusual museums. But perhaps better to follow a more traditional approach to our sightseeing, and we'll take a very polite horse and taxi to another square, this one dedicated to our old hero, Wenceslas. Whereas we had the luxury of a carriage and optional blanket, Wenceslas rides his horse in the traditional way. With his back to the National Museum and his omnipresent gaze over the square that carries his name, Wenceslas still rules over this one-time horse market renamed Wenceslas Square in only 1848. Most buildings here date from the 20th century, with the exception of the museum. In this dominant structure, there are almost 14 million items, and we could dedicate an entire programme to the contents alone. But our journey is somewhat whistle-stop, and we must venture forth down the boulevard and pay tribute to an easily missed but important memorial to the victims of communism, represented here by a tribute to two men who died in protest against the Warsaw Pact invasion of 1968. Indeed, at this time, the museum was mistaken for a government building and also took a shelling. Wenceslas Square has traditionally been the rallying point of protest or revolt in Prague. Guests at the Art Nouveau Hotel Europa would have had a safe viewing platform for all such actions over the 20th century. It is but 5 minutes to get to the old Gothic Powder Tower by foot or horse carriage. Built in 1475 on the site of an even older city gate, it is not dissimilar to the tower on Charles Bridge. Here, though, the tower was utilised for the storage of gunpowder in the 17th century, unlike its namesake in the castle, where more fervent smiths and alchemists worked on the possibility of turning lead into gold. Subject to restoration in the 1990s, it is a fine building that will stand the test of time with care. Right next door, on the site of the original palace of Wenceslas IV, we find Municipal House. An Art Nouveau construction, it has become a main Prague attraction for not only the building, but its music hall. Many Czech artists contributed to the decoration here, with large sculptures and reliefs. The main entrance is a domed portal with a semicircular mosaic playing a homage to Prague. The music continues inside, home of the Prague Royal Orchestra. A fine range of vintage composition is regularly available and extremely popular. Many famous classic musicians and conductors have stood on this spot, and even in an empty, expectant hall, you can hear the echoes of a commanding baton and the readiness of imaginary orchestras from the past. Away now to what is one of Prague's more evocative spots, a little harder to find than I expected, for reasons that will become apparent. This is the Old Jewish Cemetery. It ceased to be the site of any increase in population around 1787. The oldest preserved tombstone dates back to 1439. There are some notable historic members of Jewish culture buried here, including Rabbi Lowe, Mordecai Meisel, and of course, David Oppenheim. According to Jewish law, graves cannot be destroyed. As a result, when land is fully occupied, more soil was placed over existing graves, the old stones raised and replanted in the newer layer. There are 12 layers here, about 12,000 tombstones currently visible, and probably over 100,000 burial sites. The close proximity of the aging stones adds to the atmosphere of this hushed and reflective space. But no more so than the wall that surrounds the grounds. The Jewish cemetery was inside the Prague ghetto during World War II, and it was forbidden to display this historic resting spot. As a result, a wall was built too high for passers-by to be aware, and as a consequence, it is not easy to find until you track down the obvious entranceway. But when so many synagogues and Jewish buildings were systematically destroyed throughout Europe, why did this particular site remain intact and receive the so-called benefit of a high wall? The story goes that the Nazi Party, after the destruction of all Jewish society, would utilize the buildings at Prague to create a museum of an extinct race. The Jewish Museum that stands here now was established in 1906, and apart from the duration of World War II, has been open all the time constantly since then. It is, in fact, the most visited Jewish museum in the world, and the most visited museum in Prague. Inside here, the Pinkas Synagogue, built in 1535, was turned into a memorial to the Jews of Bohemia and Moravia murdered by the Nazis in the 1950s. On the walls were scribed the names, dates and places of birth of the many victims, but in 1968 the memorial was destroyed by the communist regime. It took about 4 years for the 80,000 names to be relisted in 1992, an extraordinary and determined memorial. Even more sombre than this, on the floor above is housed and displayed the drawings created by children from Terezin concentration camp before they were transferred to Auschwitz. only 242 children survived from the 8,000 deported youngsters, but thanks to the brave action by a teacher at the time who buried the illustrations in a suitcase, 4,500 of these pictures have secured this tragic display of history. It was a moving experience to hear the incantations, read the names of so many victims of injustice, and to see firsthand the childlike illustrations of an entire future generation. Dusk now falls, and it is nighttime Prague outside. Back then to Old Town Square, the smell of roasting and the quieter sounds of a city as the autumn chill encourages Prague's residents to shut doors and snuggle down in the comfort and warmth of their ancient city. Onwards through the narrow streets towards the river, and we can walk through history and once again onto Charles Bridge, where Prague Castle proudly illuminates the way. Pausing only to take on board one last glass of hot mead and the warmth of a Czechoslovakian goulash, we take our leave of Prague in the true knowledge that we are touched by history here. The ghosts of old bohemians wander at will, artists pour out their emotions and their music, and the steady waters of the Vltava slide underneath Charles Bridge. The soft silt of the riverbed hiding for eternity, the many keys thrown away contemptuously by all believers of freedom of speech and right of passage, whatever God, whatever creed any members of mankind wish to follow.
Blues. La commedia è finita. Thank you so much. Bye bye.